Right then, picture this. 1994's The Shawshank Redemption, only directed by Rob Reiner and starring Tom Cruise and Harrison Ford. It very nearly happened.
Stories. We would be honoured if you would join us.
1994's The Shawshank Redemption, of course, in the end, starred Tim Robbins and Morgan Freeman, written and directed by Frank Darabont and based on a Stephen King short story called Rita Hayworth and Shawshank Redemption. Also in the cast of the film, Bob Gunton, William Sadler, Clancy Brown, a lot of guys, Gil Bellows, James Whitmore, shot by Roger Deakins as well, with a beautiful score by Thomas Newman. So, the start of this story, though, takes us to 1982, and that was when Stephen King published a collection of short stories going by the name of Different Seasons. So, Different Seasons is kind of 4 stories that don't have the usual supernatural stroke horror edge that Stephen King was certainly known for at the time. So, in that book, you get The Breathing Method, you get The Body, you get Apt Pupil, and Rita Hayworth and Shawshank Redemption. And the quartet are based basically around different seasons of the year: winter, summer, spring, autumn. And he'd written them, but he hadn't submitted them earlier in his career because they weren't, his career was on the way up, primarily after Carrie in the mid-1970s. But they weren't conventional Stephen King stories. His brand at that point was more horror. He wrote books under the pseudonym Richard Bachman, such as The Running Man and The Long Walk, to kind of differentiate himself just a tiny little bit as well. There are better Stephen King experts than me. But this was 4 stories that you wouldn't necessarily expect from Stephen King. And so they were bundled together in this collection in 1982. They were, 30,000 words each. And notably, in 1986, The Body would be filmed by Rob Reiner. Rob Reiner filmed it as Stand By Me, and Stand By Me is an outstanding movie. Then, in 1998, after Shawshank, Bryan Singer, for it is he, would film Apt Pupil. And so this collection of 4 stories, 3 of them have been turned into films. Rita Hayworth and Shawshank Redemption, shortly to be known as The Shawshank Redemption, would, of course, become the most famous of them all. Now, Stephen King there's a load of film adaptations of his work. Even as I'm recording this in 2025, The Long Walk and The Life of Chuck are in cinemas. 2 brilliant adaptations, as it happens. But a lot of that comes from the fact that he's been a vehement supporter of upcoming creatives. This idea that he's got this program called Dollar Babies that some of you may have heard of. And the idea is that you can be a film student, something like that. If you want the rights to adapt a Stephen King book, you can have them in exchange for $1. The condition that you send him a copy of the film, and also you're not allowed to release it, but it allows people to make a film based on published works where otherwise they might hit all sorts of problems. Now, quite a few interesting films have come out of the Dollar Babies. And in 1983, there was an upcoming filmmaker, a writer really at that point, by the name of Frank Darabont, who he was in his 20s, and he paid $1, handed over his single banknote to adapt The Woman in the Room. As per the terms of the Dollar Baby scheme, he sent that to Stephen King. Stephen King watches these, and let's face it, he must sit through a fair amount of less good films. But he was impressed with The Woman in the Room. However, that wasn't the story that Darabont most wanted, because he'd been really taken with Rita Hayworth and Shawshank Redemption. But he wasn't at that point in a position to it just didn't feel like he was ready. He didn't have a screen credit. And so the first screen credit would actually come along in 1987, and it would be for Nightmare on Elm Street 3. And at that point, as he told Vanity Fair, that was the moment where he's like, right, I'm going to hand over my $1. I'm going to try and adapt this. Now, that novella, call it what it is, Rita Hayworth and Shawshank Redemption, doesn't even run for 100 pages and isn't immediately obvious how you would adapt it to film. Stephen King was one of those where he didn't really see where the film in it would lie. Maybe this one was best left as a book. But still, Darabont had it on his desk, but he was sidetracked by having to earn a living. And so he took on paid assignments on films like The Blob and The Fly too. Quite, deep genre stuff. And he was kept working at this. He kept chipping at it and realised he was sort of straying from King's text a little bit, inevitably so. And in the end, it was in 1992 he got it over the line. He got a script finished, and it was courtesy of an 8-week writing sprint, basically, to get this done. And so what he did is he fleshed out some of the characters. He combined some of the characters. He added a few plot points in there. He took this novella as an absolute base, but did a bunch of different things with it. So the film in the end is 2.5 hours. So what's that in screenplay? In screenplay, that's 140, 150 pages. It's already looking about the same length, if not longer, than the source material. But he had something here, and he got the permission of King to take this beyond a dollar baby and to turn it into an actual film. However, he was an actual commercial film, I should note. And he was still, though, known as a writer and not a director. But he sent the script out, and this was in 1992. And in 1992, the rocket fuel was applied to this particular project, because one of the companies where it landed was, wouldn't you know it, Rob Reiner's Castle Rock Entertainment. It landed on the desk there of a producer called Liz Glotzer. Now, Liz Glotzer, as it turned out, and this was a detail also provided by Vanity Fair many years later, was a huge fan of prison movies. If a script went into the Castle Rock office for a prison movie, Liz Glotzer was going to read it. That was it. That was her thing. And so she read it, and boy, did it land with her. I mean, I've done loads of these film stories over the years, and often it's get the right piece of material to the right person at the right time. So there's a lot of flukes involved. So you look at, I don't know, Gremlins, the original Gremlins movie. Would that have happened if Steven Spielberg hadn't been walking out his office and just seen the name of the project on top of a bunch of scripts as he was going home for the weekend? Might never have happened at all. In this case, if Liz Glotzer wasn't an employee of Castle Rock, would it have happened? Because as it turned out, they'd had that book, they'd had this collection of stories in different seasons in the Castle Rock office, because they'd adapted one of them. They'd just never read the next story. They'd never looked at the next one in the book. So Glotzer was blown away by the script, and as Hollywood legend goes, she threatened to resign if Castle Rock didn't pick up an option on Darabont's screenplay and on the film. So she passed it to the boss. The boss was Rob Reiner. By this point, he didn't just have Stand By Me to his name. He'd adapted another Stephen King story to the screen, 1990's Misery, the Oscar-winning Misery, Kathy Bates as Annie Wilkes in that. God, terrifying. So, I mean, he had form here. If you were going to do a good Stephen King adaptation, get Rob Reiner to direct it. That's a good idea. And so he agreed. He thought this script was great as well. And so it was picked up. It was a Castle Rock project. And then this is where it could have taken that very, very different turn. Because Reiner was in the middle of his hot streak. So, he was going from The Princess Bride, When Harry Met Sally, Misery, and then A Few Good Men came along. A Few Good Men with Tom Cruise and Jack Nicholson and Demi Moore. And so he and Tom Cruise were interested in working together again. And so there was an idea there that Tom Cruise could come in and play one of the two lead roles in what was now the Shawshank Redemption, the role of Andy Dufresne. Now, this would have required a bit of jiggery pokery, because Tom Cruise was really interested in it, to the point where he did a table read of the script. What he wasn't interested in doing was working with a first-time director. And this was a point where Frank Darabont was being set to direct, as well as his screenplay being used for the movie. Tom Cruise's deal to sign up for the Shawshank Redemption would have, at the very least, meant that Rob Reiner would be very, very hands-on on the production. That this wouldn't be a case of Reiner's producing and leaving Darabont to do it and just like managing it from afar, one person in Hollywood, one on location. Reiner would have to be absolutely in the trenches on it. And so a deal was put to Frank Darabont that he could take an awful lot of money in exchange for not directing the film. And then Rob Reiner would direct it with Tom Cruise in the lead role. Darabont by this point was in his early 30s and was not awash with cash at all. And this would have been a life-changing sum of money. He'd been fighting to pay the bills, and now he was being offered stupid money to give up directing this thing that had been in his head for, by this point, 7-8 years since he'd first handed over his dollar bill. And Darabont admitted that he was, quote, completely tormented, unquote, by the offer. Then Castle Rock upped the offer as well. It wasn't just, we will give you the money not to make the film, not to direct the film, but we will finance any other film you want to make if you give the director's chair to Rob Reiner. He said, and again, this was quoted to Vanity Fair in the end, he said, you can continue to defer your dreams in exchange for money and die without ever having done the thing you set out to do. And so, with some steel, he turned Castle Rock and Rob Reiner's offer down. Thus, Tom Cruise, at that point, one of the absolute most bankable film stars in the world, would guarantee a big opening weekend for the movie, was gone. With Darabont directing and Reiner hands off, wasn't going to happen. As Frank Darabont would reflect, it was a nerve-wracking decision to make. And also, it was a leap of faith, because Castle Rock, realistically, entirely within their rights to let him shoot the first few days, something like that, or bring him in for the first couple of meetings and then fire him for very little money, and Rob Reiner gets to direct it anyway. However, that wasn't how Rob Reiner was working. And instead, a $25 million budget was given to the production, with Frank Darabont getting $750,000 and a percentage of net profits to write and direct. Rob Reiner was described as a mentor to Frank Darabont through the making of the film, that he didn't interfere, he didn't get in the way, he supported. But there was that moment in time, that tiny moment where the story could have gone a very different way, because Reiner, with the press of a metaphorical button, could have had Darabont off the project, and then in comes Tom Cruise. Likely you would have got Harrison Ford in the co-role of Red, and instead you had a first-time untried director. But you did have this script, which whoever was reading it, it was going down an absolute treat. And so they were aiming high anyway with the casting. There were people in mind for it, such as Gene Hackman and Robert Duvall. And, calls were being returned. People didn't take the script and just like ghost it or anything like that. There was all sorts of scheduling problems, which meant people like Hackman and Duvall weren't going to get near it in the end. It's unknown whether they'd have actually been cast, but it was Liz Glotzer who said, what about Morgan Freeman? What a suggestion, it would be fair to say. Morgan Freeman just said is one of the best, it's worth noting, one of the best scripts he'd ever received. Tim Robbins, in fact, would describe it as the best script he'd ever had. But there was still some putting together of the cast here, because Tom Hanks was sounded out, turned it down. Kevin Costner sounded out, said no. Tom Cruise, of course, did that table read in the end, said no. And it was Morgan Freeman in the end who mentioned Tim Robbins. Now, Tim Robbins had won Best Actor at Cannes the year before for Robert Altman's Glorious, the Player. And he had profile. He working with the Coen brothers on the Hudsucker Proxy, and with Adrian Lyne on Jacob's Ladder as well. In fact, it was Jacob's Ladder that really put Tim Robbins on Frank Darabont's radar, at least. But Freeman said, what about Tim Robbins? Robbins was interested, but there was a little bit of the same concern over the inexperience of the director. And it was said to have been Tim Robbins' condition that if you are going to have Frank Darabont, a first-time director, direct this film, you need an experienced director of photography. Any suggestions? Well, he'd just been making the Hudsucker Proxy with the Coen brothers, which was shot by a man called Roger Deakins. And thus, Roger Deakins was hired, and Roger Deakins, I think, would go on to shoot Robbins's Dead Man Walking straight after. Roger Deakins came aboard, working with Frank Darabont on the film. And then the cast was fleshed out with a lot of both upcoming and experienced character actors. I love the fact that Bob Gunton, who plays the warden, was shooting Demolition Man. I love Demolition Man. At the point he was having to audition for the Shawshank Redemption. James Whitmore, Clancy Brown coming in as well, William Sadler. There were a couple of flybys that Brad Pitt was interested in the role of Tommy, but then he had other offers coming in that he took instead. There was also James Gandolfini, Tony Soprano himself, but he elected to go and make True Romance with Tony Scott. Not a bad choice, really. Can't really argue with that. But with Tim Robbins on board, Morgan Freeman on board, the rest of the cast, it was preparation time. And so Robbins would, as Entertainment Weekly reported at the time, Robbins would meet with inmates in their cells at an actual prison. He would sit there. He would have his own arms and legs in shackles for a few hours, whereas Morgan Freeman's approach was pretty much the opposite. I don't think we're quite at the contrast between Dustin Hoffman and Laurence Olivier in Marathon Man. That's a story well worth looking up. But you had Robbins who was going into prison. Morgan Freeman, however, tells Entertainment Weekly, acting the part of someone who's incarcerated doesn't require any specific knowledge of incarceration. He reasoned, presumably sat in front of a roaring fire with a nice glass of wine, if he's got any sense. He'd also been in a prison drama before, Brubaker, and he said, men don't change. Once you're in that situation, you just toe whatever line you have to toe. Shooting on The Shawshank Redemption began in June of 1993, and the script and all of those dealings had all taken place in 92, so this was moving fast. For the shoot itself, I mean, inevitably, they needed a prison. And like most of Stephen King's stories, Shawshank is set in Maine, but the production, it was a 4 or 5 month location scout to try and find a prison. They did not find one in Maine to shoot in. Instead, they ended up in a place, Mansfield in Ohio, and the Ohio State Reformatory. Now, the Ohio State Reformatory had been closed down in 1990 because it was deemed inhumane. The living conditions in it were deemed inhumane. And more than that, it wasn't just that it was absolutely deserted, it was scheduled to be demolished. I think it was said to be demolished in 92, 93. However, the location scouts found it and realised that they could do the vast bulk of the photography of the film there. As such, they had to persuade, in exchange for cash, which tends to help the local authorities in Ohio, to delay the demolition of the prison, which they agreed to do for a year, so that Frank Darabont and his production could come along and shoot The Shawshank Redemption. But what a shoot it turned out to be. It shot over the summer of 1993 in the heat, and it was 15 to 18 hour days by various reports that I've read. It was shooting for 6 days a week. They get Sundays off usually, something along those lines. And in fact, once the film was done, virtually all the complex was destroyed. But for that period of time they were there, they were in an area that didn't have an enormous amount of Hollywood-esque amenities around. A cast and crew on location, spending 6 days in a prison shooting a film. And I mean, Darabont and the production team have brought in lots of former inmates as well, both to give advice and to inform for stories in the film. Also, some of the background artists in the movie might have been resident at said reformatory in the past, or certainly have worked there. And it was a concentrated, intense time. And I mean, just to pick a sequence, there's a sequence in the film where inmates are tarring a roof in beating sunshine. And I mean, to shoot that, they were tarring a roof in beating sunshine. Sometimes what you see is pretty much exactly what happened here. And with the sun coming down, what was happening was the sun was hardening the tar. And they needed to get a few different takes of this, because if you're familiar with the film, you'll know that there's a camera move that goes alongside narration. So Morgan Freeman's silky narration to the film that had to be right. And if you got it wrong, it's another take. And what do you know? You've got to put some more tar down, but that tar's hardened over there. And this is the reality of making a film on location in the summer. I mean, not everything they did, it's worth noting, was shot in the prison itself. That the cells that you see, Darabont wanted them arranged in a certain way, and so they found a disused factory, a factory that closed down fairly nearby, and they put some sound stages on there and built the cells for the inmates on there. Also, like small little details of the film. Mark Kermode wrote a book, I think came out in 2003, on The Shawshank Redemption. And there's a bit in the film where they're watching a film in prison. I love movies within movies. I still don't think you can beat Robert De Niro watching the film Problem Child in the midst of Cape Fear. But that notwithstanding, in Shawshank Redemption, they watched the film Gilda, starring Rita Hayworth. It wasn't the one they were originally supposed to watch. That was going to be The Lost Weekend from 1945, a Billy Wilder film. And the problem was that they needed to license the footage for the film that they're watching from Paramount Pictures. And they approached Paramount, and they were given in exchange, once the bill came in too high, a list of films that would fit their budget that the inmates could watch in prison. And that's where Gilda came in. The day-to-day monotony of shooting the film, monotony might be the wrong word, but certainly intensity of it. I mean, Tim Robbins, in a story that was quoted by Entertainment Weekly around the time of the film's release, he just tells this story. Today we were reshooting a scene where I pick a maggot out of my oatmeal. And this was August. And it's worth noting, Entertainment Weekly noted it was a drought year at this point. 3 months of intense heat. And there he was picking out a maggot. And as Robin said, the first time we shot it, someone from ASPCA, animal cruelty organisation that monitors the use of animals in films, was on the set because we were using a bird that day. We were informed by the person that we weren't allowed to kill the maggot on screen. So then they had to reshoot it. And so, as Robin said, for the reshoot, someone made a little matchstick director's chair with a star on it, a maggot on the back. So they didn't kill the maggot. And in fact, in between takes, the maggot got their own director's chair on the set of The Shawshank Redemption. It wasn't the easiest of shoots. And some of these stories have come out since that Frank Darabont was a novice director at that point, and Morgan Freeman, a very experienced actor. And while Tim Robbins sort of took the fifth a little bit when quizzed about tensions during the set, Morgan Freeman perhaps less so. That, Frank Darabont would reflect, I learned a lot. A director really needs to have an internal barometer to measure what any given actor needs, he would say. But Morgan Freeman's issue with him was that he talked about how Frank Darabont would insist on doing multiple takes for, quote, no discernible difference. And in the end, Freeman just got cheesed off and I'm just not doing it. And he said, as Freeman says, for me, someone who comes to the project as a writer first is not going to be a good director. And this was quoted in Entertainment Weekly around the time of the film's release. He's going to usurp my job. And Freeman said, you pay an actor for his expertise, and if you don't use it, you'll raise hackles. Now, later in that article, he talked about how Darabont had really well directed the film. But there was a point in there where Darabont was asking for take after take after take after take, and Freeman was just, no. Tim Robbins hasn't got on record with it, so I can't put words in his mouth there. However, another person that Darabont wasn't seeing eye to eye with really was Roger Deakins at certain points during the shoot. And they had a disagreement actually over how to shoot Shawshank itself, because there was a story that Darabont was looking for a few more outside shots, certainly outside the prison, to put it in some kind of geographical context. Deakins was arguing, you stay in the prison. Unless you absolutely need to for a couple of bits in the film, and you know what bits they are if you've seen the film, you stay in the prison. It is more claustrophobic if you keep the camera within the prison walls. And apart from one or two moments where the camera goes up, you're right in there with them. Because a lot of it was shot in that prison complex, and because the prison scenes were, pretty much laid down, the script was there from the start. They did shoot a lot of those in order as well, which helped. But still, by the time filming wrapped up in September 1993, it'd be fair to say that I think most people were ready to go home at that point. Now, the edit of the movie then goes into post-production. The edit was going to come down to just under 2.5 hours. And to get there, Darabont and his team, and the film is edited by Richard Francis Bruce, had to leave several scenes on the cutting room floor. And then famously as well, there's the ending of the movie. This is a very, very spoiler-light telling of the story, so I won't tell you what the ending is. Just that there is one version of the film that if it ended 30 seconds, a minute earlier, would put a lot more ambiguity on the ending than ultimately what we get in the movie. So they test screened The Shawshank Redemption, and test screenings went off the chart. Audiences went for it very, very fast. They were getting some of the highest test scores that they'd seen, and there was suddenly this feeling, hang on, we might have something here. This might actually be a hit. This could actually do something. And so one of the things that came off the test screenings as well, and certainly in the post-production process, is an argument over the ending of the film. And as I understand it, Darabont would have been quite happy if it had ended a little bit earlier on a note of hope. And against him was Liz Glotzer, Tim Robbins, Morgan Freeman, who were just favouring the version that added a bit more certainty. I think I can delicately put it that way. The ending that we got is the one that adds a little bit more certainty. it went into cinemas. It's worth noting as well, one of the reasons, I didn't know this, that they changed the title, or one of the side effects of it, was they'd had a lot of agents sending in people who could possibly play Rita Hayworth. They'd not read the script, but they'd seen the title. It's just like, anyway, that notwithstanding, the film debuted at the Toronto International Film Festival on September the 10th, 1994. It had cost $25 million. It would debut in US cinemas on the 23rd of September, 1994. The critical response to it, I mean, when you consider how the film is regarded now, I would say the critical response was a bit more 7.5, 8 out of 10. That some really, really went for it, but most people were about 3/4, 4/5 of the way up the charts. Roger Deakins' photography, hugely acclaimed. A couple of people straight away saw this is absolute standout and really, really banged the drum for it. But there was some pushback, quite a lot more pushback than you might expect given the reputation of the film now. That separately, that both Tim Robbins and Morgan Freeman got notices that kind of pushed at their performances a little bit. One critic said something along the lines of Forrest Gump goes to jail. And it was less ecstatic than I was expecting, because by the time it came to the UK, it wasn't until like February the year after. And the reviews when it came to the UK were really off the chart. But on the American release and on that Toronto debut, less so. It opened in the US, though, that weekend of the 23rd to the 25th, 1994. Columbia Pictures had its deal with Castle Rock, and so put the film out into cinemas. They released it into 33 cinemas for its opening weekend, hoping for a very big screen average, and then you build your momentum, and who knows, there might be an awards run in it. And the decision looked vindicated on week one. I mean, it was in 13th place, but on 33 screens, it had a screen average of $22,040. So, I mean, that's the figure to focus on. The gross was $727 million, but to get to a $22,000 screen average, that is a lot. The second highest screen average in the chart was for Robert Redford's Quiz Show. We just lost Robert Redford at the point I'm recording. I adore Quiz Show. That was on its second weekend, and its screen average 13,000. Topping the chart that weekend was Time Cop. I mean, if you're going to lose to anyone, lose to Time Cop. That's a good motto in life. Its screen average was 3,600, but it was a 23 million by that point in the bank, an 8 million opening weekend. In second place was, I really, really like this film, the Charlie Sheen skydiving vehicle Terminal Velocity, which I will happily battle anyone that it's better than Drop Zone. It's a minority opinion, but I'll go for it. Other films around, Forrest Gump was on its 12th week and in third place. Clear and Present Danger, Natural Born Killers, The Mask, and Milk Money, True Lies, Whoopi Goldberg, and Corinna. But the test for the Shawshank Redemption will be what happens when you up the screen count. Well, the second week, they only upped it by 4, stayed in 13th place, screen average still around $16,000. Ed Wood opened on 2 screens that weekend with $35,000 a screen. The River Wild was the number 1 movie on the weekend of September the 30th through October the 2nd. Shawshank went up to 328 screens though on its third weekend of release. So now we're into October the 7th to the 9th, 1994. Screen average still holding around $6,000, but a $2 million gross really. And while the film was having word of mouth, it wasn't really taking off, and instead the box office top film of that weekend was Sylvester Stallone and Sharon Stone in The Specialist. The nookie scene in The Specialist is still one of the funniest things I've seen in cinema. Also the bit where basically the top floor of a building falls off, and let's just say it doesn't particularly work in a convincing way. Shawshank's American run would then, it would gradually expand, and it would hover around the bottom end of the top 10 right till the end of October. But by the time it left US cinemas on its initial run, this was not a home run. $28 million, $35 million budget. It would be remiss to call the film a flop, but you could certainly call it a financial disappointment. It had been in the top 10 for just 3 weeks, and the highest it had got in the US box office chart was 8th place. That was it. Now, much has happened since, of course. And in fact, I remember after the film's initial release, there was a bit of a post-mortem, and they were like, did we get the title of the film wrong? And in fact, I think either Robbins or Freeman was certainly saying, yeah, the title's confusing. What is The Shawshank Redemption? Can you remember that name to recommend it to someone else if you've only heard of it once? Oh, you must. I've seen the film. I booked it for a film club once upon a time, and I got an invoice that said The Shawshank Redemption. It's like even the film booking people didn't quite know what it was around then. I think it's Simon Mayo on the Kermode and Mayo show says you get a lot of Shawshank, not a lot of Redemption, and it was a confusing title as much as it's known now, and not the kind of title you easily recommend to film to friends. Time Cop, you know where you stand with that. No wonder Time Cop did great. If Shawshank Redemption had been called Time Cop, who knows what would have happened. But while the post-mortem was going on, there were people watching the film, and there was an Oscar campaign going on. And the start of the Shawshank redemption, if you like, was when award season started to roll around. Notably, the film got 7 Oscar nominations. It got one for Best Picture, Morgan Freeman for Best Actor, Frank Darabont's screenplay, the cinematography, the editing, the sound, and the score. It got a couple of Golden Globe nominations. They don't count, obviously. Screen Actors Guild Awards, got nominated for that. Directors Guild of America Awards. It got next to nothing. It won next to nothing. There are a couple. Deakins won from the American Society of Cinematographers, but no Oscars, nothing. In fact, I mean, it was bad luck the year it came up at the Oscars, because the 5 Best Picture nominees that year were Quiz Show, which I think is a masterpiece, Pulp Fiction, Forrest Gump, Cultural Phenomenon and a Half, 4 Weddings and a Funeral. I mean, it was struggling to displace most of those films. Whatever you think of the merits of them, a couple of them are more cookie cutter for award season. Forrest Gump walked away with an awful lot of stuff. However, then fate took another turn. So the Oscar nominations certainly helped. And I mean, I remember going, it was just as it was being nominated for Oscars. It came out in the UK. I went the opening Friday night, the showcase in Aintree. Barely anyone there. This one was a really slow burn. But the Oscar nominations helped. The VHS release helped. Then in America, the TNT network's headed up by a mogul by the name of Ted Turner, and he was looking for material for his network. And part and parcel of that, he bought up Castle Rock Entertainment. Now, what this meant was that when Shawshank went to television, it didn't go through the traditional networks. It went straight on to Ted Turner's, and he could play this in fast rotation time and time and time again. There's a bunch of film stories of films that were basically discovered because of television. It's a Wonderful Life is an amazing example of that. If it wasn't for television, would it? Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, rotation on television, it finds its audience. Shawshank bubbled up, and then the word of mouth was going. Really going. I mean, I remember watching EastEnders here in the UK, soap opera EastEnders, and at one point, and it never happened, one of them said, "Oh, I've got this video to watch, Shawshank Redemption." So they've never done anything like that before, but it was starting to seep through. Then IMDB came along, and in particular, the votes for the IMDB top 250 films of all time. It looks to me like they've taken some of the tar off the roof that they used in the film, stuck it to the #1 spot at IMDb top 250, and just stuck Shawshank Redemption to it. It has consistently, the occasional tickle from The Godfather, been rated on IMDb as the #1 film of all time by reader votes. Its legacy and reputation, but just built. And I mean, you can tell really in the same way that my beloved Field of Dreams generated a tourist boom for a baseball field in Iowa. So the Shawshank Redemption started to inspire similarly unexpected trips to the Mansfield area in Ohio. Even though the prison had been levelled a year after the filmmakers had gone, they'd left a couple of bits. A New York Times piece from 2014 revisited the locations and was reporting that, quote, tourism has increased every year since Shawshank had its premiere. In 2013, the movie brought 1,800 visitors to the area and produced an estimated $3 million boost to the local economy. And the prison itself wasn't even there. The oak tree isn't even in that area. But such was the power of, and such is people's love of the Shawshank Redemption. It's a really harsh film as well, that it inspired them to go and see where it was made. For Darabont, he would jump 4 or 5 years on to his next film would be another Stephen King adaptation, The Green Mile, with Tom Hanks. Big Warner Brothers release. Again, lots of Oscar nominations, stuff like that. His other really compelling Stephen King adaptation is The Mist. If you've seen The Mist, you know what I'm on about. But The Shawshank Redemption is regarded by a good chunk of people as one of the greatest films of all time. And as someone who was there on opening night, let me just say, there weren't that many people saying that on that particular evening in Aintree.